Unit 3.2, Angles and Parallel Lines. In Unit 3.1, we learned the different names, corresponding angles, alternate interior angles, consecutive interior angles, and so forth, as they pertain to any two lines cut by a transversal. Now we're looking at the case of when a transversal cuts two parallel lines. What we can say about that, knowing that a transversal is cutting two parallel lines. So for the first one, corresponding angles postulate. If two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then each pair of corresponding angles is congruent. So in this picture, since we know that A is parallel to B and T is a transversal, then we know that angle 1 and angle 5, which are corresponding angles, that they are congruent. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 5. Angle 3 is congruent to angle 7. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 6. And angle 4 is congruent to angle 8. And our notation for that is parallel lines cut by a transversal gives us that corresponding angles congruent. So on a quiz, a test, or homework, I expect that you will say this and not the name of the theorem or postulate. The next one we have is alternate interior angles theorem, and this one states if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then each pair of alternate interior angles is congruent. So in this picture here, angle 4 and angle 5 are congruent. And the other pair of alternate interior angles we have is angle 3 is congruent to angle 6. The notation we use for that is parallel gives alternate interior angles congruent. So instead of having to write out that whole entire sentence, all I'm asking you is to write this down. Consecutive interior angles theorem. Remember, these are angles that are on the same side of the transversal inside of the two lines that we're looking at. For example, angle 3 and angle 5. When we look at these, we know that consecutive interior angles are supplementary. So we have that angle 3 and angle 5 are supplementary since the two lines are parallel, and angle 4 and angle 6 are supplementary since the two lines are parallel. Our notation for that is parallel lines give us that consecutive interior angles supplementary. Alternate exterior angles. When we looked at those yesterday, those were angles that are on opposite sides of the transversal outside of the two lines we're looking at. So here we have angle 1 and angle 8. And in this theorem, it tells us that they are congruent. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 8, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 7. Our notation is parallel gives us that alternate exterior angles congruent. Perpendicular transversal theorem tells us that if we have two lines parallel, so we know ahead of time that A is parallel to B and that T is a transversal that is cutting the two of them, if that transversal is perpendicular to the other, to one of the if that transversal if that transversal is perpendicular to one of the parallel lines, it is perpendicular to the other. So here we have is that perpendicular to one parallel line gives us that is perpendicular to the other. So I want to find the measure of angle 15. So I want to find this measure. Given that angle 11 is 51 degrees. We're told by the picture that x is parallel to y. That's what these little arrows meant. We talked about that in the previous chapter. So since they're parallel and they are corresponding angles, we know that they're congruent. So measure of angle 15 is equal to 51 degrees, and that's because parallel lines give us that corresponding angles are congruent. For the next problem, we're looking at angle 16. We want to find this angle here, given the measure of angle 11 is 58 degrees this time. They are alternate exterior angles, so they have to be congruent because x is parallel to y. So measure of angle 16 is 58 degrees. And that's because parallel gives us that alternate exterior angles congruent. Next, we're given that measure of angle 14. We want to find the measure of angle 14, given that the measure of angle 13 is 125 degrees. They are alternate interior angles, so since x is parallel to y, then 13 has to be congruent to 14. So the measure of angle 14 is 125 degrees, and that's because parallel gives us that alternate interior angles congruent. For the next one, we again want to find the measure of angle 14, but this time we're given that the measure of angle 12 right here is 62 degrees. Angle 12 and 14 are consecutive interior angles. Since x is parallel to y, they are supplementary. So I can do 180 minus 62, which will give me 118 degrees. So I know that the measure of angle 14 is 118 degrees, and that's because parallel gives us that consecutive interior angles are supplementary. And for the last one, what we want to find is x if we know that measure of angle 11 is 2x minus 10, and measure of angle 16 is x plus 15. Angle 11 and 16 are alternate exterior angles, so therefore they're congruent. So for this one, we know that measure of angle 11 equals measure of angle 16. Parallel gives us that alternate exterior angles congruent. So we have 2x minus 10 equals x plus 15. Subtract x from both sides. I will have x minus 10 equals 15. Add 10, I have x equals 25. And that concludes the lesson for Unit 3.2.